This is TWiT.
So, the day after we did the show, no, we didn't do it last week. Is this our first show of the new year? It is.
Yep. It is. Happy New Year.
Tim Cook began the new year Wednesday, and this is our first chance to get together to talk about it. In fact, I was doing Twig when the chat room told me Apple shares trading's been halted. What? That's a big deal. And then Tim Cook's letter came out, a letter to Apple investors, in which he said, we told you in our last analyst call that we expected revenue around 92, 93 billion. It's going to be 84 billion. And we just want to let you know, of course, Apple immediately, the stock dropped significantly. Apple went from being a $1 trillion company to a $700 billion company. Aw. Only number 4 in market cap in the world.
Now Tim only gets to park in the multi-billion-dollar company lot when he goes to the hunting lodge in Aspen.
I thought there was a lot of, and I use the word Schadenfreude on Sunday. A lot of people. This is what we do as human beings, right? We build people up just so we can knock them down.
I knew it. I knew it.
I knew it. It is rare. The last revenue warning Apple issued was back in 2002. But they have had other bad quarters. Ben Thompson, I thought, wrote a good piece, which came out yesterday in Stratechery. He was on vacation, so it took him a little while to come out with this analysis. But he said, actually, I expected this. I think a lot of people did. And despite the Schadenfreude, the sinful pleasure in others' misfortune, this might be good news in the long run for Apple. He said, I believe Apple's management made 3 critical errors in their forecast for this last quarter. He wrote this up, actually, some months ago, that were predictable precisely because they'd made the same errors before, errors I wrote about at that time. In other words, I'm very much susceptible to confirmation bias as well. We all expected it, so we got it. If I am right, that's good news for Apple. The company's in better shape than the last week of hysteria suggests. So Tim blamed China. He said the strong dollar meant that, of course, the exchange rate was against China's favor. That the Chinese economy had been slumping, and he said over 100% of our year-to-year revenue decline occurred in Greater China. Now, Greater China, I found out, is not just China; it's also Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. So they didn't sell as well in China. But remember, this was the strategy to compensate for dropping sales in general, right? We're going to make it up in China. So they didn't make it up in China, basically.
Right. I mean, this is the bottom line is that it bottomed out in other parts of the world already. And the growth that they saw over the last couple of years was as they moved into the Chinese market, they became more and more dependent on that for growth, not for overall sales. I mean, there's still a large number of people who are buying iPhones, obviously.
Yeah, they're still going to make $84 billion.
It's not a bad business.
Months.
Remember, a couple years ago, they did $76 billion, and that was the biggest quarter ever. Right. And so the $84 billion is not necessarily a huge disappointment.
Does it, Andy, mean that the iPhone is not, though, as successful as it should be, or we expected it?
Certainly, if they were expecting to break the piggy bank in China, that's something that that was a plan I never really understood. I wouldn't have gone so far as to say that it was wrong, simply that I didn't understand it, given that in China, Apple's been so lax over there that other services and other phones are really had a chance to already become sort of the iPhone of China. There's really no opportunity for Apple to say, "Hey, look at our entire ecosystem. Look how wonderful our network of services are. Look how wonderful our network of software is." Because China developed all kind of in its own sort of walled-in garden of its own. Apple couldn't build its own walled-in garden inside its walled-in garden. And the third thing is that my perception of Apple in China is that it really is more of a fashion brand than it is here in the United States. A lot of people with just cause continue to support Apple products because they say it's really well built, they'll last a long time, they're very well supported. I think that in China and in the United States, it's also like the fashion brand. You really want to be able to flash that Apple logo, whereas in China, you can buy one of the reasons why there's such a good market for knockoff phones is that people care about having that logo on the back of the phone. It doesn't matter to them that once they drill down past the top layer of the interface, it's actually an Android phone. Just like a lot of people, they don't care if they don't have a real Louis Vuitton bag, as long as they have a well-made bag that has that Louis Vuitton styling and the Louis Vuitton logo on it. So that's why I never understood the idea that Apple's going to crack this big, giant piggy bank full of cash that is China. And then we don't even get into the problems of what kind of controls is China going to continue to exert over a company like Apple, and what kind of effect are the trade wars going to have in trying to get products into that market to begin with. So I think that Apple has larger problems around the iPhone. Like you said, I think they've had a great they still are very, very profitable. There's no problem with them continuing to exist. But if there's a good thing that comes from this, is that maybe a lot of people outside of Apple will reflect upon the fact that Apple is mortal, and that it is not a natural thing for a company to keep having a better quarter year after year after year after year. That it's okay to simply be profitable and to have their money in a lot of different businesses. And that's what Apple's going to be like in 5 or 10 years. At some point, the iPhone is going to be a nice part of their portfolio, but the joy is going to be over for the iPhone as being their big, huge wedge of profitability every year.
Micah,
I think we've seen that too.
What are the lessons for Apple in this? I mean,
well, so it's interesting to me, I think, because we've already seen. I think that maybe Apple wasn't ready quite yet to do this whole. Now we got to be worried about this thing, and here's what's going on. But if I transcribe the earnings calls every time they come around, and so I've had a chance to listen to for a while now the way that they report these things and what they talk about. And Apple has been, and this is not new information. Apple has been saying services for so long now, and it is clear that they have been sort of like wink, wink, hint, hint, beating around the bush saying, hey, pay attention to these other companies that are within our company. And, you've got iPhone, that's great, but we're going to stop reporting unit sales and unit numbers, and we are going to sort of back away from that. And by the way, did you hear about services and also these other devices that we're selling? I think that, if there's a lesson for Apple to learn, it's kind of what who was it? I think it was Bloomberg said. Apple's iPhone warning comes years too late. I think for some reason the financial industry needs some like hand-holding and maybe did not realize that this had to happen. But it's just as Andy said, it's obvious that at some point we were going to hit this thing, and it's clear, I think, that Apple internally was planning for this and was saying, we've got to start looking at these other ways to make money, like charging people for little amounts of storage. But, that's an aside. And we've got to sort of diversify. But I think that they just didn't come to Apple's, or rather to, the world and say, hey, get ready because the iPhone's about to drop. And I don't know if they predicted it.
And my guess is that this correction, I think that they probably saw it. They probably calculated that it was going to be in the spring or one of the next 2 quarters was going to be a contraction.
They did issue a guidance, though, that was well above what it ended up being.
No, what I'm saying is that I think that they didn't think it was going to happen this quarter. I think that the reason they turned it off was we're going to have a great quarter. Because that was the holiday quarter.
It will be a record, like Maestri said last time, and you wrote it down, Micah.
Right.
That it was going to be a record quarter this year.
My guess is that they expected it to be a record quarter. They figured this is the time. If you're going to shut off the iPhone numbers, shut them off when it was a record quarter. And I think that they expected to have another quarter or 2 before it was going to be something that contracted. I think it's not that they didn't expect it to contract. It's not that I think they just didn't expect it to contract this quarter. And that was the, I think that is the distinction. I bet you they were going to talk about more services, oddly enough. But I think that the interesting thing for Apple is that what Apple has cornered, I will argue, is 200 to 300 million people who are willing to pay a premium for things just to work. And that is probably, I'm not talking about morals. I'm not talking about the way the world should work. From a business perspective, that's one of the most valuable groups of people. 200 to 300 million people willing to pay a little extra for everything to work is probably the most valuable client base you can have. So I think that there's a huge opportunity for Apple to increase services, but also products. I think that one of the things that Apple hasn't done very well is expand. They've kind of taken the culture of Steve Jobs and just continue down it. And the problem is they don't have Steve anymore. So without Steve, you can't do that. You know, you have to now spread out and have things that are not the next big thing every single time. But the problem is that Steve would look at one thing and focus on it and make it successful. And then he'd look at something else and that thing just disappeared for him. And he would just now look at this other thing and make that successful. And so what Apple needs to do now is pay attention to a bunch of things. For instance, I think that the whole home automation process is moving very, very slowly. They're starting to show off, hey, we've got a doorbell, we've got a bunch of other things. Apple should have been building those products. I mean, they should have just, you know, it doesn't, you know, they should have just said, we're going to build the products for you. And if you other people want to build into the system, that's great. But we're going to make it, because I look at, like, I have 14 Sonuses at my house, right? That came with the house. When I bought the house, it had a bunch of them. And
that's worth a lot of money.
So I was like, do
house.
these come with the house? And they're like, yeah, it came with the house. Yeah, I was like, I'll take it. Like, literally, there's speakers all through the whole house, and it's got these. But every time I do an update to my Wi-Fi, every time, like, I have to, like, go back and reset them all. There's like this huge process of updating the house's audio system every single time I do something. Whereas my Apple HomePod just fixes, you know, and new Apple products. People come in with their iPhone. Kevin Hansen was at my house the other day, and he went to go jump on the Wi-Fi, and it just pops up on my phone. Do you want to give him the Wi-Fi password? I was like,
yes,
sure.
I love that.
You know, and the thing is that it's
interesting you say that, because one of the things Thompson points out is that lock-in that Apple has here doesn't apply in China.
It may not. It may not.
Because a lot of the phones, a lot of the apps like WeChat, they use across platform. So he says there's not nearly the penalty in China for moving to an Android device.
And I agree. And I think that there's two lessons that I hope Apple doesn't learn from this. One is that they should start opening up opening everything up. And I see that a little bit when they're starting to put, like, iTunes on Samsungs and everything else.
Why
and so
would you want that? I mean, isn't that
as an Apple user, I just want everything to work. I want everything to be tied together. I want a walled garden. I want it to work. I want it to look. I just want it to look. What that experience of someone comes to my house and I give my password. My HomePod works. Eventually my car works. My glasses work. Everything just ties together. There's no external protocols that have to be figured out. I mean, the other option is that, but this will never happen. This is a foolish pipe dream. Is that everything's open and everything interoperates. But when everything's open,
never going to happen.
And when everything is open, it's a mess. Look at Android.
Yeah.
So if everybody agreed on standards and adhered to it, but nobody will, because everybody wants their walled garden.
Fundamentally, every company wants to take what it costs, an unused cost, and commoditize it, and they want to take what makes them money and control it. And those things all mismatch between every company, and that will destroy every open format ever. Yeah. And so Apple has this incredible power of, they have the hardware, they have the OS, they have the products, and they can tie all those together. And I think that there are 200 to 300 million people. And the question is can they get 200 to 300 million people to pay about $1,000 a year for different things, so that they can have their life work?
Doing with this new accounting is we're not going to look at units sold. We're going to look at revenue per customer.
And I wouldn't say,
that's the number you should be looking at.
And I would say that the cynical way of looking at that is, how do we squeeze the most out of the customer? But really, how do we provide a great experience for the people that are willing to pay for that? And there's a lot of them. I mean, it turns out that there's hundreds of millions of people that are willing to pay for that.
The possible lesson, I'm not saying this is true, but the possible lesson is that Apple might have seen what happens when they really have to compete like everybody else competes in a marketplace, that it doesn't actually work out as well as they would like it to work. That sometimes what I worry about Apple is that they're not being as strong or as competitive as they could be by wanting to be the toughest predator on a very, very isolated island that nobody else can get into. And as soon as, like, one cat or one rat lands on that island, or as soon as a creature from that island tries to compete, like with the rats in New York, they get killed really, really quickly, because they have not learned skills that every other company has learned to deal with. For instance, how to embrace other people's technologies, how to embrace open standards, how to make something that works well with another thing or another system that you have no control over. It's not it is harder.
They used to do that when Microsoft
on the Android
was the dominant operating system. They used to do that, but they haven't had to do that in the last decade.
I just find that everything that's like an open standard that you have to tie to, you just end up with all this gobbledygook.
Yeah.
I mean, as someone
that's
who
unfortunately the fact of it.
You know, so
I wish it weren't, because it would be better for everybody.
Right.
If things interoperated, but they don't, and
but
they
like
never will.
An example of the, you know, it only works if you provide enough of the solution. So Apple providing, you know, all the different pieces, and so when they don't provide, for instance, all the home products.
The downside of that is when Apple doesn't do it right, or they decide not to do something, you're out of luck. So you can't, there is no Sonos solution yet. There's a HomePod. So
no, I agree.
That's the downside to a closed market.
But I think
by the way, it's not just Apple. This chart from Bloomberg shows that in fact, smartphone sales are declining across the board. Samsung took a or you know, had a big drop too. So everybody's got to deal with this. This is
everybody has a smartphone.
Right.
I mean, so many we have smartphones. And you know, I've seen it talked about how they're like appliances now, and we don't necessarily need to give them up.
Is Apple charging too much for its phones?
Not for the people who are like willing to buy the stupid iPhone XS Max that I have that I didn't need. That like even though I had an iPhone X and I upgraded to that.
We all bought one, right?
Yeah, we got one, and they're happy with that. But I think that you know, in terms of price, and maybe like the lesson here, and I saw some folks talking about this too. The lesson here is that yes, there is finally that upper level of, okay, well, $1,500 is definitely the limit that folks are going to go. But I do think that we've reached a point where lots of people now have smartphones. And what is the, you know, for some people, the value prop is not getting a new smartphone that has a new, better screen. It's the fact that this phone that they have still works and it's just fine. And so it makes sense to me. I mean, it's like a solution. If you fill the water with salt, eventually the salt stops dissolving into the water because there's too much salt. And like now that we've hit this level where so many people have smartphones, they aren't necessarily needing to get rid of them. They aren't necessarily interested in upgrading, getting a better device. And so if there's nobody to buy the devices, then what do? You have to come up with new things. You have to come out with a subscription video service that can be not just on your own set-top box, but can be on other televisions, because folks who already have those devices might want to then pay Apple to have their subscription video service or what have you. So like this is just very clearly, in my mind, we've reached the period where it's saturation to a certain extent. And I realize there are plenty of markets where we can expand, but it's like, it's clear that Apple now is going, okay, let's look at some other ways to make money, because we can't just keep growing when it makes no sense to do so, because people have the phones and they're fine with them. And then the battery thing too, you know, it doesn't cost a whole heck of a lot to get a new battery put into your old phone, so it lasts even longer. So no, I'm not going to buy a new iPhone XS Max. Well, I'm Micah, so I am, but you know what I mean? Someone else might not do that. It seems like we're getting to that point where this all just makes sense. A lot of people can't sell more smartphones because the smartphones are out there.
We should point out, not that the stock market is in any way a bellwether, but Apple's stock today is up 2.33%. People saw that as a buying opportunity for a stock that has been tumbling for 6 months. This is the peak was October 3rd at $232. It's down now to $151.30. So, but the intraday, but today the stock is inclining up. Not that that means anything. I'm just. But if you're going to talk about market cap and
I don't obviously
stock market,
I'm on the show and I don't have any Apple.
We don't
stock.
have any Apple stock, so
but
we ain't got a dog in this.
But
I think there's also in China there's a little bit of a backlash after the trade wars and the dissing of Huawei and ZTE from the United States, that it may be seen as unpatriotic to some people in China to buy an American phone.
It does seem like, well, companies have been telling their employees not to use it,
especially because you've got great phones in China from Chinese manufacturers that are about half as much as an iPhone.
Right.
Also, we should point out that the Huawei staffer who tweeted Happy New Year from an iPhone has been demoted.
Yeah. Well, that's a pretty classic.
That's a
classic
different
error.
thing. Yeah. That's
But I think it was seen a little bit as, you know, you're being unpatriotic. You're being disloyal.